I frankly admit, whatever may be the consequences of doing so, that I was not fond of Barnjum. In fact, I detested him. Everything that fellow said and did jarred upon me to an absolutely indescribable extent, although I did not discover for some time that he regarded me with a strange and unreasonable aversion. We were so essentially unlike in almost every particular. I, with my innate refinement and high culture, my over-fastidious exclusiveness in the choice of associates, and he, a big, red, coarse brute, with neither sweetness nor light, who knew himself a Philistine and seemed to like it, was so unlike that I often asked him with a genuine desire for information, what had I in common with him? And yet, it will scarcely be believed, perhaps, that with such good reasons for keeping apart, we were continually seeking one another's company. The only explanation is that our mutual antipathy had become so much a part of ourselves that we could not let it perish for lack of nourishment. In the summer of 1877, we agreed to go together on a walking tour in North Wales. I think it was chiefly because we knew that we could devise no surer means of annoying one another. But, however that may be, it was a journey from which but one of us was fated to return. I pass by the painful experiences of the first few days of that unhappy tour. I will say nothing of Barnjum's grovelling animalism, of his consummate selfishness, his more than bucolic indifference to the charms of nature, not even of the mean, sordid way in which he contrived to let me in for railway tickets and hotel bills. I wish to tell my melancholy story with the perfect impartiality, so as not to prejudice the sympathies of the listener. I shall pass, then, to the memorable day in June when my disgust, so long pent up, culminated in one grand outburst of a not ignoble indignation, to the hour which I summoned up moral courage to sever the bonds which linked us too unequally. I remember it so well, that brilliant morning in June, when we left the Temperance Hotel in Dol Widlam and scaled in sulky silence the heights of Cader Idris, which I presume still o'erhang that picturesque village. The air up there was keen and bracing, and I recollect that I could not repress an aesthetic shudder at the crude and primitive tone which Barnjum's nose had assumed under atmospheric influences. I mentioned this when he retorted that, could I see the suit and hat I was wearing, I would feel the propriety of his nose going red. Any man in your position could at least dress like a gentleman, Bunting. Like a gentleman, I took no notice of his insult. A Bunting, for that is my name, Philibert Bunting, can afford to pass such insinuations by. Indeed, I find it actually cheaper to do so, and I flattered myself that my dress was distinguished by a sort of studied looseness that would appeal to one of a cultivated and artistic eye. Barnjum's hard and shallow organs could not be expected to appreciate it. Presently, we found ourselves skating the edge of a huge chasm, whose steep sides sloped sheer down into the slate-blue waters of the lake below. How can I hope to give an idea of the magnificent view which met our eyes as we stood there? A view of which, as far as I am aware, no description has ever yet been attempted. To our right, toward the peaks of Dolgelly, with their saw-like outline cutting the blue sky with a faint grating sound, while the shreds of white cloud lay below in drifts. At our feet were the sunlit waters of the lake, upon which danced a fleet of brown-sailed herring boats. Beyond was on the plain of Capel Curig, and over on the left sparkled the falls of Edid. As I took all of this in, I felt a longing to say something worthy of the occasion. Being possessed of a considerable fund of carefully dried and selected humour, I frequently amuse myself with a species of intellectual exercise, which consists of so framing a remark that a word or more therein may bear two entirely opposite constructions, and some quaint names of the vicinity seemed to me just then admirably adopted for this purpose. I was about to gauge my dull-witted companion's capacity by some test, when he interrupted. "Quay, you ought to live up here, Bunting. You were made for this identical old mountain." I was not displeased. For Londoner as I have been for these many years, I have the nerve and zest of a practiced mountaineer. "Perhaps I was," I said good-humouredly. "But how did you find out?" "I'll tell you."
This is Cara Redress, ain't it? Well, and you're a Cara Redress, aren't you? See? See there? That's how I get at it.
He must have been laboriously leading up to that for the last 10 minutes. I solemnly declare that it was not the personal outrage that roused me. I simply felt that a paltry verbal quibble of that description, emitted amidst such scenery and at that altitude, required a protest in the name of indignant nature, and I protested accordingly, albeit with an impetuosity which I afterwards regretted. He happened to be standing, you see, on the brink of an abyss, and had just turned his back upon me, as with a vigorous thrust of my right foot, I launched him into the blue ether, with a chuckle of his hollow jest still hovering at his lips. I watched his progress with some interest, as he rebounded from point to point during his descent. I waited, amused, until the echoes he had aroused died away on the breeze, and then, slowly and thoughtfully, I retraced my steps. I took the next up train, and before I reached town had succeeded in dismissing the incident from my mind, or, if I thought of it at all, it was only to indulge relief at the reflection that I had shaken off Barnjum forever. But when I had paid my cab, and was taking out my latchkey, a curious thing happened. The driver called me back.
Beg pardon, sir, but I think you've been and left something white in my cab.
I turned and looked, and in there, grinning at me from the interior of the hansom, over the folding doors, was the wraith of Barnjum. I had the presence of mind to thank the man for his honesty, and to go upstairs with as little noise as possible. It was quite the conventional ghost, really. Filmy, transparent, and though wanting firmness and outline, a really passable likeness of Barnjum. Before I retired to rest, I had thrown both of my boots and the contents of my bookcase through the thing, without appearing to cause it more than temporary inconvenience, which convinced me that it was indeed a being from another world. Its choice of garments struck me even then as decidedly unusual. I am not narrow. I cheerfully allow that, assuming the necessity for apparitions at all, it is well that they should be robed in robes of some kind. Barnjum's ghost, however, delighted in a combination of costume which set the fitness of things at defiance. It wore that evening, for instance, striped pantaloons, a surplice, and an immense cocked hat. On subsequent occasions, its changes of costume were so rapid and so eccentric that I could only explain them on the supposition that somewhere in space there exists a supernatural theatrical wardrobe, and that Barnjum's ghost had the run of it. I had not been in very long when my landlady came up to see if I wanted anything, and of course as soon as she saw it she came in, and she was quite objectionable. She objected very strongly, declaring that she would not have any such nasty things in her house. I pacified her by assuring her that I was only taking care of it for a friend. 'Twould be very easy to harrow the listener's sympathies here by telling a description of my terror and my guilty confusion at the unforeseen consequences of what I had done. But I think the straightforward way is always the best, and I do not care to heighten the effect by attributing to myself a variety of sensations which I do not remember to have actually felt at the time. My first impression had been that the spectre was merely the product of overwrought nerves or indigestion, but it seemed unlikely that the cabman and landlady would suffer from either of these only to witness the same thing. I was forced to conclusion that it was a real ghost, and would probably continue to haunt me until the near end of my days. Of course, I was disgusted by this exhibition of petty revenge and low malice on the part of Barnjum, which might be tolerated perhaps in a Christmas annual with a full-page illustration, but which, in real life and the height of summer, was a glaring anachronism. Still, it was no use to dwell on the unpleasantness. I told myself that I had made my ghost and would have to live with it, and after all, I had much to be thankful for. Barnjum in spirit was a decided improvement upon Barnjum in the flesh. Further, as the spirit did not appear to be gifted with speech, it was unlikely to tell tales. Besides, Barnjum was absolutely unknown about town.
His only relative was an aunt resident at Camberwell. There was no danger of the spirit being identified in the circles to which I belonged.
It would have been folly to shut one's eyes to the fact that it might require considerable nerve to re-enter society closely attended by an obscure and fancifully attired apparition. Society would sneer considerably at first and make remarks, but I was full of tact and knowledge of the world, and I knew too that men have overcome far more formidable obstacles to social success than any against which I should be called to contend. And so, instead of weakly giving way to unreasonable panic, I took the more manly course of determining to live it down. When I went out to breakfast the next morning, the wraith insisted upon coming too, and followed me, to my intense annoyance, down St. James Street. In fact, for many weeks it was almost constantly by my side, and rendered me the innocent victim of mingled curiosity and aversion. I thought it best to affect to be unaware of the presence of anything of a ghostly nature, but by and by the whole town began to ring with the story, and I found it impossible to pretend ignorance any longer. So, I told everyone that it was an artfully contrived piece of spectral mechanism, of which I was the inventor, and for which I contemplated taking out a patent. This might well have earned me a high reputation in the scientific world, if Masters Maskelyne and Cook had not declared that they had long since anticipated the secret of my machine, and could manufacture one in every way superior to it, which they presently did. Then, I was obliged to confide, in the strictest secrecy of course, to two members of the peerage, both persons of irreproachable breeding, with whom at the time I was exceedingly intimate, that it was indeed a bona fide apparition, and that I rather liked such things about me. In a very short time, the story had gone round the clubs and drawing rooms, and I found myself launched as a lion of the largest size. I received invitations everywhere, upon the understanding that I was to bring the wraith of Barnjum, who was to be seen at the finest houses in town for the remainder of the season. I was even asked down for shooting by several wealthy parvenus, with a secret hope that the ghost might be convinced to stay with them permanently, thereby imparting to their brand new palaces the necessary flavor of the ancestral ghost. To tell the truth, whatever novelty there was about it soon wore off. In fact, too soon, for as fickle as society is, I have no hesitation in stating that I had hoped it would last at least a second season. If only Barnjum's ghost had not persisted in making itself so ridiculously cheap that, in little more than a fortnight, society was as sick of it as myself. And then the inconveniences which attached to my situation began to assert themselves more and more emphatically. I began to stay at home in the evening, and here I observed that the fandom had a not unpleasant trick of illuminating itself at the approach of darkness with a bilious green light, which, as it was not nearly strong enough to enable me to dispense with a reading lamp, eventually began to depress me. Then it began to absent itself occasionally for days, which often left me worried, relieved as I was at my personal freedom, at what nefarious activities it might be up to. I had to leave the rooms where I had been so comfortable, for my landlady complained that the street was blocked up by a mob of the lowest description from 7 till early in the morning, that she could really tolerate it no longer. On inquiry, I found that this was owing to Barnjum's ghost getting out upon the roof almost every night after dark, and playing the fool amongst the chimney pots, causing me, as its apparent owner, to be indicted 5 times for committing a common nuisance, for conducting an unlawful assembly, and I spent all of my spare cash in fines. I believe that there were portraits of us both in the Illustrated Police News, but the distinction implied in this was more than overweighed by the fact that Barnjum's wraith was slowly, but surely, undermining both my fortune and my reputation. It followed me one day on the underground, and behaved so shamefully that a lawsuit ensued, a 9-day sensation in the legal world. You are doubtless aware of the celebrated Metropolitan District versus Bunting, in which the legal precedent was established whereby a railroad company is entitled to refuse ghosts, specters, or any other supernatural baggage, and moreover, may levy heavy penalties from passengers who infringe on its bylaws. But Barnjum's ghost was bent upon alienating me from high society also. For at one of the best dances of the season, at a house where I had with infinite pains just established a foothold, that miserable phantom disgraced me forever by executing a decidedly objectionable species of can-can between the dances. Feeling directly responsible for its behavior, I apologized profusely to my hostess, but the affair found itself into the journals, and she neither forgave nor recognized me again. Shortly after that, the committee of my club, one of the most exclusive in London, of course, invited me to resign, intimating that by introducing an acquaintance of questionable antecedents and disreputable exterior into the private lounges, I had abused the privileges of membership. I had been afraid of this when I saw it following me into the building, arrayed in Highland costume and tall hat. Up to that time, I had been practicing at the bar, where I was doing pretty well. But now no respectable firm of solicitors would employ a man who had such an unprofessional thing as a phantom about his chambers. I threw up my practice, and had no sooner changed my last sovereign than I was summoned for keeping a ghost without a license. Barnjum's ghost had ruined me, and therefore I considered why I should not endeavour to turn an honest penny out of it. It was genuine. As well I know. It was, in some respects, original. It was eminently calculated to delight the young and instruct the old, and there was even a moral or two to be got out of it. And though it had long failed to attract in town, I saw no reason why it should not be a great hit in the provinces. I borrowed the necessary funds, and soon had made all the preliminary arrangements for running Barnjum's Wraith on a short tour of the provinces, opening at Tenby, South Wales. I took every precaution, travelling by night and keeping within doors all day, lest the shade, which was deplorably destitute of the commonest professional pride, should get about and exhibit itself beforehand for nothing. So successful was I, that when it first burst upon a Welsh audience, no ghost could have wished for a more enthusiastic reception, and, for the first and last time, I felt positively proud of it. But the applause gradually subsided. It had not struck me till that moment that it would be necessary to do or say anything in particular during the exhibition, beyond showing the spectators around the phantom, and making the customary assurance that there were no deception and no concealed machinery, which I could do with a clear conscience. But a terrible conviction struck me as I stood there bowing repeatedly, that the audience had come prepared for a comic dialogue, incidental music, and dances. As it was, however, the Wraith could be induced to do nothing at all beyond making rude faces of the audience, and thereby making an idiot fool of itself and me, an exhibition of which they soon wearied. I am perfectly certain that an ordinary magic lantern would have made a far deeper impression upon them. Whether the Wraith managed in some covert way, when my attentions were diverted, to insult the national prejudices of that sensitive and hot-blooded nation, I cannot say. I only know that after sitting still for some time, they suddenly rose as a man, chairs were hurled at me through the ghost, and the stage was completely wrecked before the audience could be induced to get away. It was all over. I was hopelessly ruined now. I paid for the smashed platform and windows with the money that had been taken at the doors, and then I travelled back to London third class, that night, with the feeling that everything was against me. It was now Christmas, and I was sitting in my shabby Bloomsbury lodgings, watching with a miserable, apathetic interest as Barnjum's Wraith, clad in Roman toga, top boots, and a turban, flitted about the horsehair furniture disinterestedly. I could only hope that this insidious shade
now that it had hounded me down to poverty, would consider this as sufficient expiation of my error and go away and leave me in peace. But I felt, only too keenly, that it was one of those ideaed apparitions which never know when they have never had enough of a good thing. It would be sure to stay and see the last of me. At once, there came a sharp tap at my door, and another figure strode solemnly in. This, too, bore the semblance of Barnjum, but that was cast in a more substantial mould, and possessed the power of speech, as I gathered from its addressing me instantly as a cowardly villain. I started back, stood behind my armchair, and faced these two forms, the shadow and the solid, with a feeling of sick despair. "Listen to me," I said. "Both of you, so long as your original proprietor was content with a single wraith, I put up with it. I did not enjoy myself, but I endured it. But a brace of apparitions is really carrying the thing too far. It's more than any one man's fair allowance, and I won't stand it. I defy the pair of you. I will find means to escape you. I will leave the world. Other people can be ghosts as well as you. It's not a monopoly. If you don't go directly, I shall make a ghost of myself." Presently, the solid form spoke. "Blow your brains out by all means. I know not what all this nonsense you're talking about is. I'm no ghost that I'm aware. I'm alive, no thanks to you. And to come back to the point, you scoundrel." "Barnjum, and alive? If that is so, will you have the goodness to tell me what right you have to this ridiculous apparition here?" He did not seem to have noticed it particularly till then. "Hello, what do you call that thing?" "I call it a beastly nuisance," I said. Ever since I last saw you, it's been following me about everywhere in a very annoying manner." Would it be believed that the unfeeling brute only chuckled at this? "Can't say I knew anything about it, but all I can say is that it serves you jolly well right. I hope that it will go on annoying you." "This is ungenerous," I said, determined to appeal to any better feelings Barnjum might have had. We did not part on the best terms, perhaps, but, well, considering that you kicked me over a precipice when I wasn't looking, we may well take that as admitted. "See here, Barnjum," I said, determined to make a last effort to move him. "It's a ridiculous thing to cherish an old grudge all this time. You must see the absurdity of it yourself." He apparently did not. "'Tis Christmas Eve, Barnjum," I said earnestly. "Christmas Eve. Think of it. At this hour, thousands of throbbing human hearts are speeding the cheap but genial Christmas card to such of their relations as they consider it all likely to respond with a turkey. The costermonger, imaginative for the nonce, is investing damaged evergreens with purely fictitious value, and the cheery publican is sending the member of his village goose club back to his cottage home, rich in possession of a shot distended bird and a bottle of poisonous port. Hear my appeal, Barnjum. I was hasty with you. I have been punished. That detestable thing on the hearthrug there has dogged my path to misery and ruin. You cannot be without some responsibility for its conduct. I ask you now as a man, nay, as an individual, to call it off. You know you can." But Barnjum wouldn't. He only looked at his own wraith with a grim satisfaction as it capered in an imbecile fashion upon the rug. "Do," I implored him. "Oh, please do. I would do it for you, Barnjum. I've had it about me for 6 months, and I'm so sick of it. You didn't deserve it. But be it so." And then, turning to the ghost, he spoke. "Here, you. What's your name? Avaunt. Do you hear me? Hook it. Out. Scram." It wavered for an instant, and then, to my joy, it suddenly gave all over, and shrivelling up with a sort of cobweb, was drawn by the draught into the fireplace, and carried up the chimney, and I never saw it again, At last I was free. Now, Barnjum's escape was very simple. He had fallen upon one of the herring boats in the lake, and the heap of freshly caught fish lying on the deck had merely broken his fall instead of his neck. As soon as he had recovered from the effects, he was called away from this country upon urgent business and found himself unable to return for months. But to this day, the appearance of a wraith is a mystery to me. If Barnjum had been the kind of man to be an esoteric Buddhist, it might be accounted for as an astral shape. But esoteric Buddhism requires an exemplary character and a year of more of abstract meditation, both of which are conditions far beyond Barnjum's attainment. The shape may have been one of those subtle emanations which we are told some people are constantly shedding like the coats of an onion, and which certain conditions of the atmosphere and the extreme activity of Barnjum's mind, under certain excitement, possibly contributed to materialize in this particular instance. Or perhaps it was merely a caprice of one of those vagrant poltergeists, or supernatural buffoons, which took upon itself, very officiously, the duty of avenging my behavior to Barnjum. Upon one point I am clear. The whole of this system of deliberate persecution being undertaken directly on Barnjum's account, he is morally and legally bound to reimburse me for the heavy expense and damage which have resulted therefrom. Hitherto, I have been unable to impress Barnjum with this principle, and so my wrongs are still without redress. I may be asked why I do not make them a basis of an action at law, but persons of refinement will understand my reluctance to resort to legal proceedings against one with whom I have at least lived on a footing of friendship. I would fain persuade and shrink from appealing to force, and I have besides not yet succeeded in persuading any solicitor, even a shady one, to take up my case.
This broadcast has been provided with the assistance of the head archivist, Society of Virtuous Pagans. This tale was presented by August Brotherton. Our sound and editing were provided by Creative Minds Audio. Our logo was designed by Mazface, with the Helios radio created by Kieran Byrne. This story was adapted by Alex Bagassi from F. Anstey's March 1879 story as published in the Temple Bar. It is used under public domain license. All persons, places, and related media have been treated with the Nagoya Memetic. Have faith. We know.